Welcome back to History 120. This week I want to explore the rise and changes of American democracy in the early 19th century. Essentially, this is a period of time that historians call the Age of Jackson, Jacksonian America, Andrew Jackson's America. But Andrew Jackson is a great exemplar of the changes that go on in this era and how we, as a country, changed our approach towards the way we elect and participate in democracy. Andrew Jackson exemplifies the rise of the common man. He is one of the millions who took part in Western migration. He is coming to power at a time where Western migration is picking up steam in various areas of the country. He's also coming to his presidency in the late 1820s as a man who is going to benefit from the expansion of universal white male suffrage. What that means is the laws have changed since the writing of the Constitution, and we have eliminated property qualifications for the most part from the requirements to vote. This allows white men above the age of 21 to participate in American democracy. This is a radical departure from the way the founding generation had defined the voting populace. And so we see Jackson's rule heralded as the opening of a more democratic age. But in the rise of a new democratic age, we have problems we'll talk about today with the expansion of slavery, how this country deals with Native Americans. Essentially, the 1830s will define America and American freedom for much of the rest of the mid-19th century. So who is Andrew Jackson besides the guy on the 20? Jackson is the son of Scottish immigrants. His parents are Scots-Irish. That means that they are descended from people from Scotland who moved to Ireland as part of the British occupation of Ireland in the 17th and 18th centuries. Jackson is born in 1767 in the Carolina backcountry. There is actually debate about where exactly he was born. We have a letter written by Jackson that says he was born in South Carolina, but it was written around the time of the nullification crisis. And there is other evidence that seems to indicate that Jackson may have been born in North Carolina. So we're going to leave it with the Carolinas. Although there is some conjecture that Jackson's birth date might be wrong and that he may have been born in Scotland. There are some people who believe Andrew Jackson, because of the vagueness of his birth, may have been the first president who was, or the only president who was born outside the confines of this nation, and was elected to the presidency when ineligible. He grows up the son of tavern keepers in the Carolina backcountry. His father dies when he's about 10. The Revolutionary War in the South ramps up in the early in 1779, 1780, and he and his family will become involved during the war. He's theoretically around 14 years of age. He will act first as a messenger and then as a soldier in the Revolutionary Army. He loses two brothers in 1781 as well as his mother because of the war. One brother is killed in combat. He and another brother are captured at a local plantation where they had been sent for safekeeping. And while they are in British custody, one of his brothers, I believe, develops smallpox. And then when he is released, his mother will catch smallpox from him as she tries to nurse him back to health. Ultimately, both the mother and the brother die of the disease. Jackson is grievously wounded in 1781. When he's captured at this plantation, a British officer demands that he polish his boots. And Jackson refuses. Jackson hates the British. He's a revolutionary, and the officer will take his sword and strike Jackson with it, slashing his left hand and his face, which will leave scars for the rest of his life and deeply embed his hatred of the British. As with many backcountry people in the 18th century, Jackson is poorly educated. He doesn't have a very wide schooling, but he will continue on to become a lawyer following the American Revolution. You say, wait, you just said he was poorly educated. How can Jackson be a lawyer? Becoming a lawyer is much different in the 18th and 19th centuries than it is today. It wasn't a highly professionalized occupation. In order to become a lawyer, you essentially apprenticed yourself to someone who would agree to teach you the law. And what you do is you spend several years, as they call it, reading the law. You act as a secretary and as a copy person for the lawyer that you are studying under. But by and large, if you aren't working, you're sitting there reading your law books, memorizing them, and you will then go in front of a lawyer and undergo an oral examination to determine how well you understand the law as you read it. And once you've done that, if the judge agrees, you are then a lawyer. Jackson in 1788 will move to Nashville as a relatively poor backcountry lawyer dealing with land claims and some personal law. But his position will take off from there. As he earns more money, as he earns an income through his law practice, he will buy land. Land is very much the basis of wealth in the 18th and early 19th centuries. He will become a very successful planter, increasing his land holdings and buying more land, more slave, raising cotton, tobacco, and other agricultural crops. This will raise his position in society. He will serve a term in the Senate that he absolutely hates, and he will also lobby to be elected the leader, the brigadier general in charge of the Tennessee militia. This will happen at the end of the 18th century. By and large, Jackson's military career is largely one of the early 19th century. He will be in charge of the Tennessee militia, which honestly, unless you're under attack or being called out for defense, means that you have a fancy uniform you put on a couple of times a year. In 1812, he will offer his men and services to the United States Army because of the War of 1812. And rather than going to Washington or serving on the East Coast, Jackson and his men will serve in Georgia and Alabama, fighting the Creek War. They will be fighting tribal groups that have allied themselves with the British, mainly in the hopes of removing Americans from their territories. He will gain his reputation as an Indian fighter. That's where he actually gains his nickname, Old Hickory, because of his perseverance, his tenacity, and his fierceness on the battlefield. Following the Creek War, he will be sent to New Orleans in order to orchestrate its defense as a British fleet appears in the Gulf of Mexico. He will win the Battle of New Orleans with a coalition force of Kentuckians, urban New Orleanians, the U.S. Army, and pirates. He will also win the Battle of New Orleans after the War of 1812 has ended, but that's because we have slow communications in this period. He'll also be famous for fiercely enforcing martial law in the city of New Orleans. Essentially, New Orleans is a city, it has always been a city of mixed ethnicities and mixed nationalities. And there is fear of people supporting the British movement and needing to defend New Orleans for the Americans at all cost. And so Jackson will order and enforce a possibly a tenuously legal martial law in which he highly restricts civil liberties in the name of defense. After this, Jackson will fight and lead troops in the Seminole Wars in southern Georgia and the Florida Panhandle. Essentially, Jackson is an Indian fighter who has broken off to fight the British one time. He is going to be responsible for major territorial losses from the southeastern native tribes even before his presidency. Because of the Creek War and the Seminole War, major chunks of what will become Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida are all ceded to the United States. The Seminole War will also help push the Spanish out of Florida and into Florida into a territory of the United States in the name of recapturing runaway slaves and taking away their shelter from the Seminole Indians. Politically, Jackson's rise is tied to the War of 1812. As I mentioned, he had served one term in Congress in the 1790s. He hated it. He is reelected in 1823 as a means of gaining a national voice by his political backers. And he will run for president in 1824 based almost entirely on his military reputation. He will lose in 1824, and he will lose a very bitterly contested race to John Quincy Adams. It is said that he loses because of the corrupt bargain. Essentially, there are, I believe, 4 or 5 candidates for president in 1824. John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and the other 2 aren't important. No candidate succeeds in gaining the number of electoral votes necessary to win the presidency in 1824. So it's a very close election, and it goes, as the law dictates, as the Constitution dictates, to the House of Representatives to be voted on there. And it maintains a statistical tie. And ultimately, Henry Clay approaches John Quincy Adams. Clay is in 3rd place. He's basically an also-ran at this point. And Clay will say, I will give you all of my electoral support, all the people who voted for me, I'll give you their votes if you make me your Secretary of State. Because essentially in those days, Secretary of State was seen as a prime minister and a stepping stone to the American presidency. John Quincy Adams agrees. He will win the presidency, defeating Jackson, and Jackson will be bitter towards Clay and Adams for the rest of his life. He is the one who coins the term the corrupt bargain that elects John Quincy Adams. He goes home, he leaves Washington, leaves the seat in the Senate, and within a year, the Democratic Party in the state of Tennessee will nominate him for president for the 1828 campaign. This gives him a 3-year period to effectively campaign for the presidency in 1828. This is still, to this day, the longest period of time that an official nominee has been able to campaign for the presidency. And this time he runs as the voice of the common man. The 1828 election picks up where the 1824 election leaves off, with Jackson's hatred of John Quincy Adams. He paints himself as an opponent from day one of the Adams administration and the Federalists who have elected him. He runs as an anti-corruption candidate. Pardon me one second. Sorry about that. Thought I hit the pause. He runs as an anti-corruption candidate, a populist running as the voice of the common man. And what we see develop from here is probably one of the nastiest attack-filled campaigns in American history. If you guys think that politics in the 21st century is partisan and constant and using bad language, you ain't seen nothing yet. Jackson is going to be attacked by the Adams administration. Not because of his policies, not because he's the voice of the common man. He is going to be attacked by Adams and his supporters on a deeply personal level. It's not bad that he is a slave owner. He is seen as a slave trader. A slave trader is an immoral individual who buys and sells human beings and separates families. Jackson had bought and sold slaves. He had made profit off of this, but this wasn't his main source of income. Despite that, he will be seen as a horrific dealer in human flesh. He'll be seen as a cannibal, having been rumored to have eaten the British dead or Native American dead during the War of 1812. They will claim that he is the son of a common prostitute, his mother a whore at the backcountry inn that she helped run. He is a murderer. He is a murderer because he has executed American soldiers for dereliction of duty and to maintain discipline, as is the right of a military commander in these days. The coffin handbill that we have here will be printed and circulated by Jackson's supporters, talking about the misdeeds and bloody history of General Jackson. They'll even claim that Andrew Jackson's wife is a whore. Rachel, his wife, had been previously married. She was an abandoned woman. Her husband left her. And it was assumed that because of her husband's abandonment, she was no longer legally married when she became involved romantically with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson loved her deeply. It was not a marriage of convenience or political advancement. It truly was a romantic, loving relationship of partners. Unfortunately, she had not been divorced from her previous husband at the time of her marriage to Jackson. It was resolved within a year. The question was resolved within a year of their marriage, but it hung over Jackson's head throughout the 1828 campaign. This is a two-way street. Jackson is going to attack John Quincy Adams as having a pool table in the White House, an immoral tool of gambling and sport in the people's house, paid for by people's tax dollars. He'll even say that Quincy Adams essentially was an American pimp, that when he had served as a minister in the court of the Tsar of Russia, he had provided American virgins to the Tsar for sexual gratification and for advancement of the American cause in court. It is a horrible campaign. It is so bad, in fact, that when Andrew Jackson's wife dies in the months after, a month after the election, she dies in December of 1828, Jackson will blame John Quincy Adams for her death. She dies of a heart attack. And it could very well be that stress had something to do with this. We can't know. We're not able to diagnose diseases nearly 200 years in the past. But Jackson never forgave Adams. The election of 1828 is so polarizing, it is seen to end the era of good feelings, that period of time when essentially there were no political parties in America following the War of 1812, and we were Americans voting for slightly different candidates. We were all in a jovial, great mood. That wasn't the case anymore. And so with the election of 1828, we enter the age of Jackson. And nothing personifies Jackson's age of the common man more than his inauguration. Presidential inaugurations in the 19th century, and especially the early 19th century, were open to the public. Essentially, you, as the winning candidate, were expected to provide a festive time for those visiting the White House to congratulate you. In the past, this had been people who could afford to travel to Washington and supporters of the party. Hundreds of people would show up. They were major for Washington, but minor affairs to be forgotten overall. When Andrew Jackson was inaugurated president in 1829, 20,000 people attended the inauguration. Jackson was expected to stand there and shake everybody's hand. I can't imagine how much his hands must have hurt after shaking that many hands. And the people that visited were not the best of society. In many ways, they were Andrew Jackson's common man supporters who came to congratulate their personal candidate. And when they came, they destroyed the White House. Imagine 20,000 people in an afternoon passing through a building. They not only walked through spilling food, breaking dishes, causing massive amounts of wear on the floors and the carpets. They tore up the couches. They tore up the tables. They cut up the drapes so that they could have souvenirs of this moment. They could have a physical memento of Jackson's inauguration, of being personally in the White House. And they were a mob. It was absolutely just horrendous, the damage that they did. That kind of previews a lot of Jackson's administration. One of the things that happens very early on in Jackson's administration is the Eaton affair. One of his cabinet ministers is married to a significantly younger woman in her 20s. It is a scandal, and the wives of his selected cabinet ministers will not associate with Peggy Eaton because of her age and because of the rumor mills talking about her being a common whore who has stolen the husband of another more respectable woman. And Jackson will lash out at his cabinet and berate them for the way they treat Eaton and his wife, the way they are embarrassing everybody. In many ways, it is a chance for him to avenge the death of his own wife by attacking those who are doing something similar to another woman. It is actually so fractious that Jackson will maintain his cabinet, but he will not discuss his administration with them. He will not meet with them. What we'll see is the rise of the kitchen cabinet. The kitchen cabinet is an informal group of advisors and friends who meet in the White House kitchens with Andrew Jackson to discuss policy and how the government should be run. Imagine if we had a president who has a major falling out with every cabinet officer that he has, and he ends up talking to whoever his friends are or whoever will provide him a friendly ear to determine his policies. We also have issues surrounding the Tenure of Office Act under the Jackson administration. Jackson will be known as King Andrew I because of the Tenure Office Act. Essentially, this is the spoils system. The Tenure of Office Act was meant to help rotate governmental officers, not cabinet level, but the petty bureaucracy that keeps a government running. It was good to rotate these officers every once in a while, and they should have job protection, but they could be fired at the behest of the president when a new president came in. Essentially, Jackson will take the Tenure of Office Act and he will use it to fire the vast majority of the petty bureaucracy in the American government and use those jobs to reward loyal members of his Democratic Party that have supported him and got him elected. This is why it's called the spoils system. When you win a war, you are allowed to make spoils of the captured goods of your enemy. Well, Jackson has defeated John Quincy Adams for the presidency, and he has the right to fire everybody that worked for Jackson and replace them with people he wants to have those jobs. This is everything from cabinet ministers and tariff collecting officers in ports to the local postmaster. Jackson will fire them all and replace them with Democrats at every level of his government. We'll go ahead and pick up the rest of the Age of Jackson next time. I hope you guys have a great day.